Lord, thank you that you are present with us. And we confess our need to hear from you and to have you be with us and direct our time. That my efforts of preparation and the thoughts and concerns that everyone is here with this evening, Lord, those are all secondary to your voice, which speaks through each one of us and speaks to us, so that you take the words that are being said and you form them into what needs to happen in our lives, so we can hear things that we wouldn't have heard otherwise apart from your Spirit. So we confess that and depend on you and look forward to what you're going to say this evening. Amen. Now, much of what we covered in the spiritual formation class is useful in doing spiritual direction. So, think of some of the things that we did, the exercises we did the first few sessions, the ones that were especially meaningful to you. Now, not all of those. You can't do soaking prayer in spiritual direction because there's only one of you, unless you're doing a group spiritual direction. And there could be two of you doing soaking, 2 or 3. But a lot of the things that we did are very useful if you're practicing spiritual direction with someone. Think of one of the things that we did, little exercises that we went through that you found meaningful. Can you remember any of those?
I like the timeline. Is that one you're talking about?
Yeah. Okay, now that timeline is a really good tool in spiritual direction, because one of the things you want to get accomplished is you want to find out how God has been working in their life. And you may ask them, and they'll say, well, I don't know, I accepted Christ and attended Sunday school or something. So the timeline, even if they don't identify God's presence in those events, if they do a timeline, then you can come back and ask them about it. So, well, what about this? Well, did anything change in your life as a result of that? So the timeline can be a very useful tool for you to show them God's activity. Cleansing prayer, you remember that little exercise where we prayed the prayer, it said, in the name of Jesus Christ, you were cleansed, you are free from every word that has been spoken against you. If you wrote that scripture down, then there may come a time in spiritual direction where you say, this person is bound by something some event of the past, and or maybe they can't forgive because they don't feel forgiven, or you begin to sense that, then you could use that. Lectio Divina is entirely appropriate tool to use in spiritual direction. You'll hopefully remember the 2 words that you used to describe God. That's a good exercise, to ask them, what are your 2 words? So, you can look back through your notes, or just think back to the things that you found especially helpful to you personally, and then use those things when the time comes, if you're familiar with them. Dixon, you did some of those prayer things in group activities with the prisoners, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And the ones that can be adapted to one-on-one, or even when you do it as a group in one center, and you're doing some spiritual direction there. It's not intensely personal, but you're putting them in tune with some feelings and experiences that God can use to shape them forward. And that is a form of spiritual direction. The thing we talked about last week, or last time we met, Allen's 3 movements of the spiritual life. The first one is that we move from a place of loneliness to solitude. If you understand that, then a person can be talking to you. One of the first times I got any spiritual direction at all, I referred to this guy. We used that illustration of of the turtle, the ectoskeleton and the endoskeleton. I got that from Stan Thornburg, and one of the first times that I got any kind of spiritual direction, it was from Stan. And the question that he asked me was, "Are you feeling lonely?" It was when I was just beginning into that 2-year-long dark night of the soul, and he asked me, "Are you feeling lonely?" And I said, "No, I don't think that's it." And over the course of the next week, I realized that's exactly what I was feeling lonely. And I tend to think of loneliness as missing people, you know, but that's not what he's talking about. And that's not what we talked about last time. Loneliness is just feeling estranged from God, separated from people or whatever. Even if you're surrounded by friends and family that you care about, and you know they care about you, you begin to feel these feelings, and you're not sure what they are. And it's often easier to understand loneliness by realizing what you're doing in order to mask those feelings. You know, you're indulging yourself in recreation or games or some kind of escapist behavior in order to not face those feelings. And when you finally identify it as loneliness, then you can begin to deal with that. So that's one of the reasons we spend so much time on that. You identify the loneliness, you identify the hostility, and you identify the illusion that's happening in these people's lives, and then you can turn them to a place of solitude, of hospitality, and prayer. So almost everything we've covered in spiritual formation is useful to you in offering spiritual direction. So that's the review that I wanted to get at. That's why you do spiritual formation before you do spiritual direction. Because you get you get a great deal of the tools that you need for spiritual direction from understanding spiritual formation.
You know, I just wanted to let you know, I really, you know, last month we talked about how we seek intimacy. And it was kind of interesting. My daughter works night shifts, and you know, it seems when we chat, it always revolves around a TV show she's watched or a TV show she's, you know. And it was interesting, rather than say to her, "You're watching too much TV," to say to her, "What do you think you're seeking?" You know, and I said, you know, my sense is that you're looking for a deeper relationship, you're looking for something to see, and it opened up. I mean, we had a wonderful conversation. It was just a mind blower. It was awesome, and it acknowledged something in her that I don't think she had thought about. But then to have her think about it, and it was just very cool language. So I appreciate it very much. So I do see. I mean, a lot of these things that we talked about in terms of understanding what your needs and what your desires, and maybe some doors you have closed to help people find those other things and have that self-illumination. Very cool. So I appreciate that.
That's good. I'm glad you said that. Because in offering spiritual direction to somebody, it's not wrong to watch TV, it's not wrong to do fantasy football, all kinds of activities that people get involved in these days. But when you begin to see them spending a whole lot of time, and you begin to sense that maybe they're dulling pain, or they're getting self-worth from achievements in any number of different areas, then you can say, okay, they really are, there really is a need to know God deeper, and that is distracting them from the Lord. And then you can kind of get them headed in the direction. So it's not that those activities are bad, just like Dixon bringing up that Facebook and those kinds of things can be a good tool, or it can be a substitute for intimacy. So you kind of pay attention to that stuff, and then God gives you some insight. Because the goal is for people to know Christ, to know Him well, to have the love of Jesus be the greatest reality of their lives. which is what we started off with in the whole spiritual formation. Okay, beginning the spiritual direction relationship. If you're going to offer spiritual direction to someone, you need to get them to tell you their story. The timeline comes in good. Let's say you're starting a spiritual direction relationship with somebody formally, or it's kind of happening informally. If it's happening informally, then you're just showing interest in them. You ask them questions. Where are you from? How many brothers and sisters do you have? Tell me a little about growing up. Get them to tell you their story. And as they're telling your story, if they say something that sounds significant, kind of file it away. If you're doing formal spiritual direction, I have a notebook, and after I'm done meeting with a person, then I write down some thoughts. This is what I sense. This is what I heard. And then I go back and look at that periodically. But you get them to tell you their story. And in that you can see God's activity in their life. And if they get good at telling you their story, then you'll hear all of these different little conversion experiences that they have. Where they went from being this kind of a Christian to walking deeper with Christ. What was it that happened? I'm going to tell you a story about a conversion experience that I had. It was 1982. I was in Dallas, Texas at the National Youth Workers Conference. And this guy was there I'd never heard of before, Anthony Capola. So he was supposed to speak the second or third day. He was teaching seminars up to that point, but the lady who was the keynote speaker the very first evening, she worked with the Salvation Army. Her name was Eva Den Hartog, and she was flying in from Europe. The plane got delayed, so they said, Capola, will you take over? So he spoke the first day. He got done speaking. I crossed off all the seminars, and I went to, if he was doing it, I was there. You know, I had all these ideas of things I needed to attend. I thought, what I really need to do is listen to this guy. So about the third session that I went to, it was about social issues, social justice issues. And he got up and he made this statement. He said, today, 30,000 children around the world are going to die from solvable diseases, mostly because of diarrhea. All they need is something akin to Gatorade, something similar to that, to solve that need. 30,000 children will die today, and you don't give a shit. And what's really sad right now is that a bunch of you are more disturbed that I just said shit than you are that 30,000 children are going to die today. That was a conversion experience for me. I was upset. He didn't need to say that word. That's a crude, rude word, and I don't want to hear it from you. And I focused on that word and completely blew off 30,000 children were going to die. That was a conversion experience. Lord, forgive me. I still don't think you ought to use bad language, and I don't use bad language. But Lord, forgive me for my righteousness being so wrapped up in what I don't do and what I don't say, as opposed to who I am and the things that I'm working for. That was a conversion experience. Changed my life. I actually started spending more time paying attention to the Quaker history from then on, because I thought this guy's telling me about what friends always did, man. They fed the poor, they helped the needy, they did all these incredibly good things. And I like talking about what they did, and I wasn't doing a whole lot of that. So that right there, that was a conversion experience. And when you get people talking about their life story, then you hear those conversion experiences. What happened? What changed in your life as a result of that? Yes, that was a positive experience, but what changed? How come you're different because of that? So, in telling you their story, that you're listening for those and probe, it's okay to probe a little bit there. Clarifying questions are good if people are hurting, But if you're telling their story, you can probe a little bit more. When was some other time? Did you ever go to any conferences? Did you ever experience something that made a difference in your life? Yeah. Well, what changed as a result? Get them to tell your story, because in there you'll see God's activity. And again, the timeline is helpful there. Landmark experiences. The longest spiritual direction that I've given was to a guy back in Colorado Springs. This guy was a really difficult fellow, and man, our relationship went on for 4 years, and I had to look really hard to see the progress, and I had to be. In this case, it was my patience, me being patient with him and saying, I really believe that this guy is redeemable. I really believe that some good things can happen. And I have to keep bringing him back. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? I have to keep reminding him of the progress that has been made, because he forgets it so quickly. But then when I remind him, well, that's right. The guy was irresponsible, couldn't hold a job, wouldn't hold a job. And so I just say, you've had this job for 4 years. That's a big deal. You're providing for your wife and your kids. And you didn't do that for the 4 years prior to that. You never held a consistent job. Well, that's right. Well, why do you think that is? Because he's surrendering to God. So patience is awfully important. And part of patience that I've been hitting on is perceptivity. You have to be perceptive. Is that a word, perceptivity?
It is now. No word was a word until it was put in the dictionary. So you can make it up.
That's right. My daughter's favorite example of that is the word irregardless.
Irregardless.
It is not a word, but it's in the dictionary now. It made it in the last edition.
Oh, no.
But you know what I also hear you say as well, which is very cool to me, is discipline. Because if you're going to spend 4 years with a guy in that relationship, it could get very comfortable. It could be about, did you see the Texans play last night? So, they're really patience and discipline. I see you've got perseverance there, so I can see that play. I would think that would be the danger. I mean, very extended 6-7 years to begin to.
And two things come to mind as we're talking about that, and really two ends of the spectrum. You're talking about your experience with the guy that came one day and never showed up again. And I've had that experience recently, and it was actually with a couple. And they showed up one time, and I've talked to them on the phone a couple of other times, and they said they'd like to get together, but it never happens. They don't call me back to set up an appointment or anything. So I'm wondering about that, as well as the 4-year time frame. At some point, and maybe it's the being perceptive. How do you know when it's too long? How do you know when you're still progressing? I mean, I think that's the results-oriented part of it. It is a process, but the process can, I think, run its course, and then you're not making progress. Then you end up talking about football games or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think you can progress infinitely, probably to some extent, but and maybe this is the perception part. Where do you discern to draw the line? And I'm assuming that's going to be different in every situation according to whatever the Holy Spirit tells you to do.
And according to what role you're playing. If you're in a pastoral role, then you say, okay, I'm going to quit offering spiritual direction, but I'm going to continue to be the pastor. So I'm going to give them advice, as opposed to being the spiritual director, that you're not there to give them advice. So your relationship may change. Or if you're not a pastor, or if you're a part-time pastor, or you're bivocational, you have to decide how much time you have. So there comes the discernment right there. Lord, if I don't do anything other than invest my time and energies in this person, I know that you love them and their value to you is immeasurable. And if that's what you want me to do, then I can do that. But if that's not what you want me to do, I don't want to be a martyr. So yeah, discerning that.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly don't want to become, the word martyr is, I think, perfect there, because you don't want to be a martyr to the expense of your family, for sure. Because that's your first ministry as a parent, and as a husband or wife. The other thing is, there are other people out there that may need your services, whatever, and probably are. And so, and you can spread yourself too thin. I mean, you can do spiritual direction with 3 or 4 people maybe. I guess depending on what your energy level is and what your time commitment is. I'm not a very good person to gauge those kind of things. Because I could spend my whole life here. I could spend my whole life in this meeting with you guys, and I could spend my whole life with my family. And I just like being around people. And I think maybe to your point, Dixon, I would be more apt to say I could spend the rest of my life talking to this one person, or 2 or 3 people, or whatever, if I weren't discerning. And that's why the question,
I think that's where the perception comes in. Are you perceiving God to be at work in this relationship? Is God using this relationship in their life? Is God using it in your life? Is God pleased with this relationship? Keep going.
And does that come from your planning, though? Because what I perceive, and I know Dave and I have talked about this, you say you don't always go in with a plan. Sometimes you just show up and you say, okay, we're going to find out what God wants for us today. And in my mind, to sort of guard against what you brought up, Dixon, about just talking about just anything out there, in my mind, I'm thinking I've got to go in with some sort of idea that we're going to get something accomplished spiritually speaking. It doesn't have to be a drawn-out plan, maybe, but it does have to be sort of results-oriented in some way. Whether the result comes today or 10 years from now, I don't know, but it has to be heading that direction.
That comes under point 4 that we're going to be looking at. Okay. So we're going to address that. No problem. That was a good question. I'm glad to say that we'll be covering it instead of saying one of your jobs in doing spiritual direction, or one of the goals, is to see God's hand at work in the ways that the person who is describing their situation can't see it. They got blinders on. They can't see it. So you note the struggle, the progress, and you point out what they cannot see for themselves. I was at a pastor's conference, and a lady asked for prayer. Pastor's wife, she asked for prayer because she is struggling. She cannot forgive her mother for some of the experiences of the past and her mother's resistance to deal with things. And as she describes it, she just keeps going, I just need you to pray for me, I just need you to bind Satan, and she has all these little formula things that she's using. And when she's done, I have a clear picture as can be that the problem is not unforgiveness. That this woman has forgiven her mother and forgiven her again and is always willing to forgive her, and she has a forgiving heart. The problem was that she was grieving a broken relationship. And so after everybody got done binding and praying the way she wanted to pray, and everything calmed down, I said, let me tell you what I'm saying. You have a broken relationship with your mom and you want it to be whole. And it's not whole. And that grieves you. You feel bad about it. And that's good, because you ought to grieve a broken relationship with someone that important. But you're also free from being bound by this sense of unforgiveness. You've forgiven her. You love her. Forgiveness is in your heart. And as I begin to speak these things, this light bulb goes off. Yeah, it just doesn't work. I forgive her, and it doesn't work. Well, the reason it doesn't work is because you're not doing the right thing. And I think you'll see that often in relationships where people start talking about forgiveness. If you're talking to some real solid Christian, somebody who's trying to follow Jesus, and I just can't forgive him, often that'll be the case. They're grieving the brokenness of the relationship, so you help them come to terms with that and say, you submit that to God, and you grieve it, and you feel badly about it, and then at some point you'll be able to just release it. And so what'll happen is then periodically maybe you'll feel that grief again, but you identify it. You identify it for what it is, and you're able to deal with it so much easier. Don't beat yourself up for not forgiving, because you have. So that's when you perceive things that others, that they can't see themselves, because maybe they don't have the right terminology, or maybe they've learned the wrong words, or had the wrong paradigm given to them, and you listen, the Holy Spirit gives you some insights, and you perceive that, and then you speak that, and that's what you do as a spiritual director. They can't see it themselves, so you introduce it to them. You don't do it perfectly every time, but when it happens, it's pretty cool. My wife does that really well. We sometimes do tag team spiritual direction, and when we do, it's just never gone badly. Every time, the things that I see, she doesn't, and the things that she sees, I don't. She says, that's right on. And it's like a mosaic. We put the two, she puts her pieces in, and I put my pieces in, and it comes out, and we have the picture of what we need to do. So spiritual direction, tag team spiritual direction can work really well if you have two people who are both perceptive. We do that with couples. It's been a while because she, with her work schedule now, the opportunities for us are pretty slim, but I have enjoyed doing that. And the fourth thing is perseverance. Remember we talked about the wilderness experience? For those in the wilderness, you just have to keep encouraging them. But patience and receptivity and all those things. I wish I'd have found a better word. I'm becoming less and less happy with receptivity here. Every time I say it, I'm becoming less happy with it.
Well, there's receptivity, not that there's perceptivity.
Thank you, Lord. Keep on doing what is right and good. I gave spiritual direction to a guy who was, I think I told you this, he was struggling with depression and different things. He had some issues that we had to give some attention to. And I was getting a little frustrated because I thought, I'm not helping this guy. And I'm just saying the same thing every time. We get done and I'm not telling him anything new. You just need to hang in there. You need to keep on doing the things that you know to do. God is at work in your life. When you leave, the next time, you need to hang in there. You need to keep on doing the things that you know to do. God is at work in your life. And I write that and I think, man, am I ever going to say anything new to this guy? About 6 months later, he had this breakthrough. He says, man, you were just right. I just had to keep on going. And then God it brought it all together for me. And so then I thought, okay, it wasn't me just being a one-trick pony here. It was saying what I truly felt like needed to be said. He was in the wilderness, and he needed Moses to help him get through the wilderness, not the sons of Korah, who said, you've spent enough time in the wilderness, now let's get out. Let's go take the promised land. And God says, no, you've got a whole bunch more years to be in the wilderness. And so listen to the one who knows, not these other people, the wishful thinkers. So, perseverance, both with you and with them, encouraging them to persevere. And that's where that's where when you read a lot of different stuff, if you hadn't been exposed to John of the Cross and the concept of the dark night of the soul, if you hadn't been exposed to that, then maybe you wouldn't discern that someone who's in a wilderness experience and that God has a purpose for it, a purpose to purge things out of them, to make them into somebody new. If you hadn't had that, done that reading and had that experience, you wouldn't have the ability to discern that, and you do some damage. You know, give them the magic prayer to pray. Just say this 15 times. And you need to get more active. You need to be doing these things. You need to start making positive confession that Jesus is Lord. Say that strongly every day. Jesus is Lord, and you'll come out of this. Well, if God tells you to say that they're chronically down, they're a negative person, and they need to start thinking positive thoughts, then yeah. But if they're in the wilderness, you're going to do them some damage. So again, that's why you read broadly. You get exposed to a lot of different things because God will use that to help you in the discernment process. Okay, any thoughts about that? Any questions or responses to those other areas? Did we ever talk about how many of you have thought you've been through a wilderness experience in your spiritual life?
I think I remember asking you, maybe bringing that up one time, but I don't remember.
Yeah. Boy, I think it was that spiritual retreat that I led for a church that the pastor asked me to describe it, and I had a hard time coming up with it. I said, because it's definitely different than depression. It's not. I mean, some people may struggle with depression through it, but it's not that. It's loneliness is a deep part of it. It is because you don't feel the closeness of God. Where is God? God is distant from me. And so loneliness is a strong part of the wilderness. But one of the things that I did talk about that was that how important it is to build your rule of life so that when the wilderness experience does come, that you keep doing those things through your wilderness. Because it's really difficult when you're in the wilderness to all of a sudden develop a discipline of silence and solitude. You don't want silence and solitude. It's really difficult to develop a discipline of worship because you want to be away from people. You don't want to go to church. I don't feel good. And they're going to be singing these songs. And they're going to be joyful and all this stuff. And I don't want that. I don't feel like that. So it's very hard to develop a rule of life when you're in the middle of the wilderness. But your rule will get you through the wilderness. So that's critical.
My experience of that has been a changing thing, because I remember early in my Christian walk, and I think it's a whole lot different for Christians as opposed to somebody that God is wooing into a relationship with Himself. And I've seen, looking back on my spiritual walk, that early on I was doing the complaining thing. I was going, why is this happening to me? And a lot of times it showed up with I guess it looked like depression to me. I mean, to the point early on where I wasn't seriously contemplating it, but suicide wasn't far off the map. That was as a teenager, and I think a lot of teenagers go through those sort of feelings. But in the later years, these last, 5 or 10 years maybe, I've found that it's more of a deepening thing. While it's very uncomfortable, and I still have a sense of heaviness, it's got the underpinnings of trust and love, and that I know God has the best for me, and that I still don't understand it, and it's still difficult, but it's sort of like being married for long time to the same person. You have that sense of trust, and even though you got battles of will and personality and all that kind of stuff, you have a sense of trust that that relationship's not going to go away, and the other person is looking out for you. And especially with God, that's a huge thing. And I was really appreciative that you brought up that book about St. John of the Cross, because it made a whole lot of sense in that regard.
That was one of the books, or that was the book that you chose, right? Yeah, that's great to get that understanding that God is purging something. And that's what happened in the wilderness, right? It took 40 years to purge the slave out of the children of Israel and make them into citizens of the new land. And so that's one of the purposes. Another purpose that Jesus, his 40 days in the wilderness was preparation. So you're there for a reason, and those reasons are redemptive. And so getting through that for however long it is, you're going to come out on the other side with more love, more trust, more faith, more of the good stuff.
Yeah, and it changes our focus. I mean, it changes our focus on less of me and more of my focus on who God is, what He's doing,
Right.
and wanting to meet Him there rather than Him coming to meet my needs.
Yeah, and it's not on my terms.
Right.
Which is
the hard part, I think. You know?
Which is an essential lesson for the Christian to learn, right? God is going to do something in my life, and it's not going to be on my terms.
Well, and that breeds all these other things: presence, patience, perceptiveness, perseverance, all those things that we can have with other people. So that in our other relationships, we are softer and more malleable. We're not as dogmatic about you must do this, and this, which I think in the Christian terms is a lot of the surface stuff we see a lot of times. You must pray like this to get out of your depression. You must do this or that or whatever. And I think going through those things personally gives us a feel that God doesn't do it the same in me every time. He certainly doesn't do it the way He does it with me with somebody else. We're all different, and we all go through different things, but we have the same God, and He loves us as much as He loves the other person. And so we have more, more grace toward another person going through that.
Yeah. What's the saying? If the only tool in your belt is a hammer, you'll treat every problem as if it's a nail. And so wilderness gives you some more tools. And then you will use those in spiritual direction. And that's just important. God is going to, that's one of my key words about God. God is redemptive. God will redeem those experiences so that they become useful in my life for redemptive purposes in another person's life. God will use them. It will shape me. I don't like it. I wish that hadn't happened. But God will redeem it. I don't think God brought it there. I don't think God caused it. I don't believe in that level of predestination at all. But I do think predestination is that God has destined and foreordained that those experiences become redemptive. That's you do that. Right? Okay. I'm sorry. I'm getting off of spiritual direction and into theology. That may bring up some other subjects. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll finish up. You gotta know the right thing to do at the right time. Okay, developing your style. We're going to look at that and we'll be done. You'll need a Bible too, because we're going to look at some scripture. What kind of a style works best for you? And part of the determining factor will be what kind of a role you're in. If you're doing spiritual direction for someone and it's very part-time, you're in a camp or a prison or whatever, you're limited, then you're probably going to be non-directive. But if it's, so there's your, Brian, are we going to come and just see what the Lord does? That's non-directive. If you have a plan for when you get together, we're going to begin by 5 minutes of silence. Then I'm going to ask some questions. I'm and maybe when we're done, I'll encourage you to do some reading or to practice a certain spiritual discipline, then that would be more directive. You kind of have that in mind ahead of time, and that's okay. You just have to figure out what your style is and what works best for you. I use both styles, depending on the person and the situation. The fellow that I met with for 4 years, it was very directive, but yet it was informal in a lot of settings, because this guy was a mechanic, and the only time we could ever meet was on his lunch hour. So we'd meet twice a month, and we'd go to a restaurant, and we didn't have a lot of time for prayer. But then there'd come times when I realized, based on what had happened the 2 previous sessions, that we were going to get something, go to the church, which was close by where he worked, and we're going to sit there and I'm going to pray for him, and we're going to be very directive and very formal. During this time, we're going to eat this food, and then this will be the agenda for that day. But that was based on what had happened in the previous meeting. So you have directive and non-directive, formal and informal, and I tend to be formal directive. That's what works best for me, but I also find that if when I go too informal, then I'll talk about Rocky's baseball or fishing or something. I can get off pretty quickly. So I'm learning to talk more about Astros baseball. I'm an Astros fan, but I'm really a Rockies fan, so I'm doing both. Directive or non-directive, formal or informal? Are those terms, did I give enough explanation where you feel comfortable with that?
Mm-hmm.
Dave, what would you say your primary style would be?
I think I'm kind of like you. It just depends on what the situation is.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you just have a very limited amount of time. So I think mine is probably non-directive would be a better one for me, because before I have spiritual direction, I'm crying out to the Lord, please help me.
Yeah, for you to do that on the Emmaus walk or the youth version of that, yeah, I'd say it'd be a good idea to have some very specific things with you, some specific recommendations, and then to see what happens, so that these kids have, or the adults, if you're doing it for them, they have some resources. Your style may be informal and non-directive, but you have some resources at your disposal to give to them or recommend to them should the occasion arise. I think that'd be a good idea. And you may take some books with you or have these resources and never use them. And that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'd be a good idea. Now the third thing on there is biblical imagery. Notice when you read through the scriptures what you're drawn to. And then those can be tools that you use in spiritual direction because they're very comfortable for you. The 2 images that are very comfortable for me are the images of water and light. And so we've used a little bit of a few of those during our time together. But like Revelation 22, 1, 17. Did I list these scriptures there for you?
Maybe on page 2. I don't see Revelations.
No.
It's not listed under biblical imagery? Negative. Okay. So, now I didn't list those because these are mine. But Revelation 22:1 says, "And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb." So you use the image of water and the source, and then what it brings to your life. It's going to bring purity. So the water washing over you, when I do meditation, when it's at its most effective, is when I'm by a body of water. I'm watching the river, water washing down the river. I'm at a beach, watching the waves come in. There's something about that. I picture the water washing over me and cleansing me and just making me pure before God. So that kind of imagery works for me. So then I relate it well to people, because it's something that has made a lot of sense to me. So I'll give you these references in case you're drawn to the water imagery. John 4:14, Revelation 22:1, and then 17. And the Spirit and the bride say, "Come," and let him who hears say, "Come," and let him who thirsts come. Whoever desires, let him take the water of life freely. Come to the water. So the invitation, I find that invitation helpful to me. And so I can relate these kind of images a little easily. Joel 2:28, Ephesians 5:18, 25 through 26, and Hebrews 10:22. There are more water images than that, but those are some of the ones that make sense to me. And then the image of light. And I talk about that. Light always wins over darkness. When light shines, darkness disappears. You can have your eyes closed, and if I shine a bright enough light, how many times have you been awakened by the light that comes on, you know? Sleeping outside. If you ever go camping, get wakened up, you're awakened by the light. So it doesn't matter. Light will always dispel darkness. In John 1 through 18, all the pictures of light there. Matthew 5:14, where Jesus proclaims something that I have a hard time accepting. You are the light of the world. No, Jesus, you're the light of the world. Jesus says, no, Jim, you're the light of the world. You are the light of the world. Okay, that's true. That's what he said about us. And of course, he is the light, and it's the light we get from him that shines through us. But to accept that, that's a very humbling thing. To accept that Jesus said that about you, us. What a wonderful challenge. What a wonderful reality. You are the light of the world. And so that's empowering. It's humbling. It's all of the positive and all of these humbling things simultaneously. 1 Corinthians 4:5 and Ephesians 5:13. So what in developing your style, as you read through the scriptures or as you hear the stories of the Bible that jump out to you, just grab onto those images and you can use those in your spiritual direction. You'll come to a situation where you say, man, this person needs to be cleansed. So I'm going to read them some scripture about the water washing over them and cleansing, or this pure source of water. I'm going to read them something about light dispelling the darkness that's inside of them, or Jesus is the bread of life. Maybe that's a term that grabs you. So whatever it is that grabs you, that's good to use in spiritual direction. Now here are the cautions. Biblical cautions concerning spiritual direction. Did I list those scriptures for you?
Yes.
All right. Okay, let's read them. So I want to get through this. So Drew, would you look up Matthew 12:20?
Sure.
Jason, Matthew 13:24 through 30. Brian, Matthew 23:8 through 12. Lori, Ecclesiastes 5:1 through 3, and Dave, Proverbs 25. These are biblical cautions concerning spiritual direction. Matthew 12:20
says, "He will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. Finally, he will cause justice to be victorious."
People will come to you who are bruised. So it's important that he's not going to further bruise you. Jesus isn't going to do that. He's not going to break that tender reed. So people are going to come to you bruised, and treat them like they're bruised. Treat them tenderly. Okay. Matthew 13:24 through 30.
This one's a tad longer. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? And he answered, an enemy has done this. The slave said to him, then, do you want us to go out and gather them? But he replied, no, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.
Okay, weeds need to be pulled out of people's lives, but they need to be done at the proper time. If we do it too soon, we'll be uprooting some of the good that is there that God can use in a very important way. So weeds need to be dealt with at the proper time. And if your mentality, and you need to realize this about yourself, if you're kind of into fixing people and fixing problems, then it's awfully easy to uproot weeds, pull them up, and then damage some of the good that's there also. If that's your mentality, is to fix people or to set them straight or whatever. So these two verses are important, back to back. We don't do further damage to people who are already damaged. And yes, those weeds are there. Don't try to pretend they're not weeds. We're not taking that approach. They are weeds, but the time will come, and hopefully then you'll know when that time is to say, okay, now we need to give some attention. We need to get rid of these things. Sometimes we jump the gun on that. So just be careful with that. Matthew 23, 8 through 12.
But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted.
I think that's probably the strongest point that was made in the book that we read. Stay amateurs. When we begin to approach it like we're professionals and we know a whole lot and we're above this person, instead of being a peer that simply has some skills that maybe they don't possess, then we're missing the point. We want to point people to Christ. He's the teacher. He's the one. He's the rabbi. He's the one who can heal and help. And we don't want them to develop any kind of a dependence on us, and so it becomes about us. And if we can stay in that amateur state, that'll keep us humble, and hopefully will keep them directed towards Christ. And so that's awfully important. I really appreciate that about Gunther. She just restates that, and then you can see it in her approach repeatedly. She never used to think too highly of herself. You would feel funny about writing some of this stuff. Why am I writing a book?
Okay.
Ecclesiastes 5, 1 through 3.
Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. As a dream comes when there are many cares, so is speech of a fool when there are many words.
The dream comes through no little effort, is the way another translation puts it. The dream that this person has of being whole, the dream that you have to see them restored to a right relationship with God, or growing, or getting past, or just whatever it might be. Whatever that dream is, it comes through no little effort. It's going to take time and energy, but keep your words few and make sure you treat them correctly in the process. I think when you approach them gently and humbly, when you get that down pat, or when you get when you get comfortable with that, then when the time comes to speak the hard truths to them, you're able to do that. If you come in ready to fix people, then you're going to say things out of turn. Jesus spoke very hard things to people on many occasions, but he was the ultimate spiritual director. He knew when to do it, right? He was so gentle with people who needed gentleness. And he said, "Come and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you'll find rest for your soul." So that's what we learn from him. We learn gentleness and humility. Then once we get that, then we'll be able to speak those hard truths when the time comes. And in Proverbs 25,
A plan in the heart of a man is like deep water, but a man of understanding draws it out.
that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to say that deep down inside of them, the God of the universe is there. And we can draw out all of that good if we're careful about how we do it, if we approach it, if we have some understanding of what God's ultimate purpose is for their lives, to make them into His image, to make them look like their Savior. So that's the goal. That's what we want to accomplish. So those are the cautions. Be careful about how you treat these people. Treat them gently and easily, but have high goals. I mean, that's what you want. You want to see them delivered from the things that are binding them, and you want to see them walking with Christ. Now, the personality cautions are: avoid trying to fix people. We've already talked about that. That might be a tendency that you have. It's a tendency I have. You see those problems, and let's deal with them. Let's get over this. Be careful of projection. By projecting, you project your experience, your fears, or the experiences of others you know or have directed onto the person you are currently working with. Just like you project onto God, you pray, "God, do this and that, I know that your will." You're projecting onto God your will. It's awfully easy to project onto other people your problems. Well, they're like me, or this person is like this other person I know. And so you begin to read into them those things. I was in a group spiritual direction, the practicum for the course that I went through. And we each had to take a turn talking about spiritual direction that we were offering someone. This one lady starts telling about this person to whom she was giving spiritual direction. And this lady was working with a difficult person and put herself in a difficult situation. And she's talking about this lady that she's helping, and the way it sounds is that this lady is stalking her. You know, so she starts describing it, and this class is full. Every single person in this class, just, they become defensive on the part of my friend Linda. Linda, you're not seeing this. And they start giving her advice, and I'm looking around the group, and I said, "Boy, there's a whole lot of projection going on right now. You're all giving her your fears, and you're trying to project her or protect her, and you're not listening to what she has to say." So when things calmed down a little bit, then I spoke and said, "I think we need to hear a little bit more from Linda. I think we need to be careful that we don't do this or that." And they all turned to me and looked at me, and when I was done talking, then they all focused back on her. I got done with the class, with the practicum, then we had to go from that to the regular class, and afterwards I took Linda aside. I said, "Linda, I'm sorry for what happened in there." I said, "Things got out of hand." She said, "Well, you didn't." I mean, she saw that I saw what was happening, but couldn't deter the other 8 people in the class from going that direction. So the next week the professor says, "This time we're going to let Linda take another class period, and we're going to let her talk." And so then everybody, they backed off. But that's exactly what happened. They projected onto her how they would feel if this was happening to them, and in the process completely lost any ability to offer spiritual direction. That happens awfully easily, especially if you've had something happen to you or someone that you love, or you begin to feel certain feelings towards this person. It's awfully easy to project onto them as they are telling you their story, and you quit listening to God at that point. Hey, I've told you about 2 instances where I got it right and everybody else got it wrong. But there have been other times when I got it wrong and everybody else got it right. I just don't remember those as well because they don't make me look as good as well. So I think you got that. The next thing on there is shy away from giving personal examples. Now, when I'm pastoring someone, I'm offering pastoral care, I empathize with them. And I try to help them understand that I know what they're going through. When I'm doing spiritual direction, I don't do that as often. I check myself. When I start to do that, I back off just a little bit. Because then it's harder for me to listen to them, and it's harder to listen to what God is saying when I'm trying to empathize.
I saw something the other day, it was a joke, but it was something like, I really hate listening to other people's stories because the whole time I'm just waiting for them to stop talking so that I can share a similar story about myself that's much more interesting and much more focused on me.
Much more interesting. Of course, my stories are more interesting. I find them more interesting.
And focused on me,
Right.
not them. I don't feel that.
So by empathizing, you're dulling your ability to listen to something new that they might say. Okay. They might have something to say that is quite unique from your experience, and by you trying to empathize with them, you miss it completely. Or maybe they don't say it. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying be very careful about that.
It's really a two-edged sword. I mean, I really appreciate your caution. I work with a man who's dealing with his father dying of cancer. My dad died of cancer. And he had very unrealistic expectations how his father should behave. And I never even thought about it. But as he spoke and shared how he was feeling, I was thinking, hey! I felt that same thing. And I immediately realized that if I went into a Me Tooism, it would have destroyed it. I don't think I ever, in the year we met, I ever even mentioned my father. I don't think he even knew that my dad died of cancer. Because I knew that if I opened that door, it would change the whole flavor of the, you know, it's interesting. I mean, I think you probably all know this, that if you go into this sharing mode and you start allowing the person to spiritually direct you, it changes the whole flavor of what's happening. I don't know. I mean, so I fully endorse that. As a matter of fact, for me, who's somewhat expressive, I have to mentally put a clamp on that and say, just don't do it.
That's good. That's good that you know that about yourself.
Yeah.
You gotta know yourself, right? But if I'm up in the hospital room talking to somebody, I'm probably going to be doing more pastoral stuff, and so I'm more likely to empathize with them and say, you know, I think I can relate to that a little bit, but make sure I let them do more talking. So if I'm in a spiritual direction, then I do, like you said, I really try to check this. So that's, I say that because we're playing in different roles. We're all in different roles. Listen more than you talk. Do not make yourself out to be more spiritual than you are. Spiritual pride is a regular temptation. And Gunther talks about that a little bit in here too, which is good. When I stand up here and talk, I gotta make it seem like I always get it right, or I'll tell you about the best spiritual experiences I've had, and it's almost like that's normative. Well, there may be 7 or 8 years in between those spiritual experiences, but if I tell you about one of them every time we're together, then it sounds like Jim is on a continual rocket ship headed towards heaven. That's when you hear traveling speakers, they keep telling those same stories over and over again, but you don't follow them around to see the weaknesses. So it's just important that you don't try to make yourself out to be more spiritual. It's a temptation. And do not take someone to a place you have not been. Do not try to take them to a place that you have not been. You can direct them there, you can facilitate, encourage, and pray, but know that you can't guide them to a place you haven't been. There's a difference between a tour guide, right, and a travel agent. Travel agent sends people to places all over, but a tour guide knows the territory well. So if you're directing someone and they start going someplace and you know that maybe they're about to go to a level of prayer that you've never experienced, maybe they're a real mystic and they can spend hours in silence and solitude, and that's not you don't have that ability. Then don't try to guide them, okay? Because you can't guide them. You haven't been there. But encourage them, help them, learn what you can, and try to direct them. Okay, maybe you want to read this person, or let me tell you to talk to this person. I think they know a lot more about this. You can direct them. You don't have to be their spiritual superior in every aspect to direct them. But don't fall into the trap of thinking you can guide them if you haven't been there yourself. That makes sense, doesn't it? There's a level of integrity there that's really important. That's it for tonight.